good afternoon. We're going to change format just a bit here. We don't have formal papers, but more by way of a panel discussion dealing with Black Adventist history. I want to make one other quick announcement because I don't know if the word has gotten out fully on this, talking about Ellen White. There was a conference going on 3 years ago now in Portland, Maine, a series of papers on her life. And just recently, we've gotten word after various editings and so forth that Oxford has accepted it. And they will be bringing it out, I don't have the date, but probably in the next 18 months. I was thinking about, again, the typology here, and I would see that particular collection of essays probably being Category 2, Open Critical History. It's a book that will be intended more for a non-Adventist scholarly audience, but not one certainly that brings any naturalistic assumptions to the table. Well, okay, we have a distinguished panel today, and I'll just give a quick introduction, and then we'll talk about our subject matter. On my immediate left is Ben Baker, who I want to give a testimony is a terrific help here when I come into the archives, and I sort of just badger him all day long for more things I need to look at, and he always does that with a good spirit and just knows a lot about Adventist history. Ben went to Oakwood and then came up to Howard and did his PhD here in history, working on the topic of Ellen White and blacks. And what's your official title?
Assistant Archivist.
Okay. A good title. Doug Morgan, next to him, is a Midwesterner. Grew up out in Lincoln, went to Union College, worked at Union College for a while, as I recall, in radio, and then went further to the Midwest, to the University of Chicago, where he was a student of Martin Marty in American church history, and was actually a colleague for a couple of years of mine down at Southern, and has been at Washington Adventist for how long?
18 years.
Hard to imagine.
Not as long as Lee Wise.
Thank you, Doug.
And he's written, as most of you know, a work on Lewis Sheaf. We'll be talking about it a bit. And then Professor Glen Phillips here, who is at Morgan State, and is that in Baltimore?
It is in Baltimore.
Okay, I was thinking that, but I wasn't totally sure. A graduate of AUC,
Yes, sir.
and then down to Howard here
I went to Andrews. I graduated from Andrews.
with a master's degree, and then here to Howard for your PhD. Glen's had a particular interest in Caribbean history. And also you've studied about the history, though I read, the SDA community in New York City, Caribbean Black community in New York City. And we want to talk about that, the Caribbean aspect, as we go along. So thank you all for being a part of our panel today. Now, in my very uninformed way, when I think about the writings of Black SDA history, if somebody was going to ask me, kind of where does it start, I would probably think the work by Ron Grable, Mission to Black America, which came out, I don't know, early, mid-1970s, about the Morning Star. That would just be my quick answer. But in fact, I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that. And Ben, you have a great passion, I know, for historiography and Adventist historiography. And can you kind of flesh out, really, this subfield, how it's developed?
Sure, I would mark the original history of Black Adventism, as it were, with Arthur Spaulding's Lights and Shades in the Black Belt, which was an unpublished manuscript, but it was still accessible to certain people.
Do you know what year that he did that?
It was from 1912 to 1914. Those are the years he worked on it. Of course, it was not published, so there's no year of publication. Many cite Southern work by Ellen G. White, which was compiled by her son, James Edson White, as a kind of a history of the South. Of course, the blacks were emancipated from 1863 to 1865, and the Black Adventist history, as it were, starts during the Reconstruction period. And of course, it was slow. There was a period, I think that historians tend to use the word neglect. Ellen White had stronger words than that. But there was a period of neglect from 1865 to around, the 1890s. And of course, there was some work done, but oftentimes it was incidental. There are reports that blacks would actually wander into the meetings when they were not specifically proselytized. And so from there, we have black ministers like Charles Kinney. He was the first African American ordained. And from him, in the Adventist Review, we get reports of how things were going in the black work. And I would call Kinney a sort of a point man, because many of the early progress reports and things that were written about blacks came from Kinney's reports in the Adventist Review. And so, you have Southern work in which Ellen White is speaking of the neglect of African American evangelism. And from there, her son was not certainly the first, but because of his status as her son, he brought a lot of light, to the field and what was going on there. And so Spalding begins with Edson. That's where he sees the black work as starting. And obviously, because of the status of African Americans during slavery, black Adventists were not educated. And so I'm speaking of formal education, of course. They were not educated during the period after slavery, and so there were not any proper histories, as it were. I would say the first history done by an African American Seventh-day Adventist, I'm putting Hope of the Race by F.L. Peterson. I'm putting O.B. Edwards' master's thesis.
And what
On
decade
the
now?
work of-
Give us a decade when these are coming out.
O.B. Edwards, we're talking the 1930s,
All right.
and Hope of the Race by F.L. Peterson is 1942, I believe. And these are not histories proper, but it's an attempt to wed the black experience, the African American experience, with the Adventist faith. And we see some histories there. Of course, we have the Gospel Herald, in which Edson is reporting the doings of the Southern Missionary Society, and those are certainly historical sources. And we have Message Magazine, the Gospel Herald. Message Magazine came from the Gospel Herald, and we have updates and reports there. Early white Adventists saw the work among African Americans as tantamount to foreign missions. When you see the early reports, it's literally listed. You have the work in Switzerland, the work in South Africa, the work among the blacks in the South. And that's a big part of the early historiography. We have Emmy Olson when he writes Origin and Progress. Some of Spalding's early works, literally they're giving you the picture in the South right next to the treatments of the foreign fields. So that's what I was saying.
Now, just one follow-up. You mentioned the work by Spalding that came out so early. Is that a manuscript that you hold here?
Yes, and it's actually online.
Oh.
It's online archives, yes.
But no plans? You know any reason why it never appeared in print?
It's parts of it are reflective of the age. That's a euphemism, of course. But it's very, very, extremely informative, and I think it's well done. And he's very contextual. He lauds the work of Booker T. Washington, as many whites at that time did. But it's somewhat thorough. Of course, Lewis Hansen wrote From So Small a Dream. I think that's the 1940s, and that's also a work of the progress in the South.
Well, the fact that it's now online may obviate, any call for formal publication.
Sure.
But you think of something like Everett Dick's dissertation on Millerism that is only published 50 years later, something like that. So these things do happen. Well, Doug, you, of course, are an author of a book in the series, the Pioneer series on Lewis Sheaf. And I'm not sure, we've talked about that, but I don't know that I've ever actually asked you, how did you come to that project? Was there an aha moment that you came across? It might be interesting to describe sort of the background to that.
Well, the moment came right here somewhere. This is my first time here since you reconfigured things, so I don't know the exact spot. But all right, very good. I was on a project that was initiated by the pastor of the first SDA church in Washington, which goes all the way back to 1889. And this pastor, Mark Cleary, recognized the importance, of having a good substantial history of that historic congregation. And in the course of that, I started running across references to Sheaf. His name had been planted in the back of my mind by George Knight, who makes brief references to him in his earlier book about A.T. Jones, from 1888 to Apostasy. I was curious, but that's when I began to see there's something extraordinary here, just in correspondence, and then went from there.
Okay. Well, I want to come back to that and to all of you to talk about kind of your use of the archives in the work that you've done. But Glenn, let's go on to you. Now with you, we move on to a little more of an international, still North America, I guess. The Caribbean is often considered part of North America, but it's sort of a different cultural set. And you've talked about Adventism, Caribbean, Black Caribbean, and then in New York City. Go on and describe a bit for us what you've done.
First, I want to thank Dr. Trim and Dr. Baker for inviting me to be here. I feel as an outsider as they work, because I think I'm the only one who doesn't work for the church. How I started, I attended our schools and ended up back in Trinidad as a teacher of history, geography, and Bible. But my real interest in Caribbean Adventist history started as a young man. I'm a fourth generation Adventist from the island of Barbados. And when I was growing up, I constantly heard my parents and grandparents talking about not eating between meals, not eating and drinking. And they would constantly bring up the name of a Dr. Cave. And I just assumed that this guy was living when I was a kid. But later on, I discovered as I went into college and the university that he died long before. And I wondered about him. And so I decided to, we didn't have the computer at the time, so I would go to different card catalogs and look for, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing written about this man. But they would tell me about this Dr. Cave, who was an Adventist minister. And so I started to look, and I got very curious about him. And realized that he had left Barbados back in 1901 and went up to Bahal Creek and was invited to study as a nurse. And then Dr. Kellogg actually encouraged him to do medicine as well. And he returned to Barbados in 1908. And I said, and there's nothing written about him? He said, what about the other people who contributed to Adventist history in the Caribbean? Maybe I need to look at that. So I finished the article and I sent it. There was a journal we had called Adventist Heritage.
Sure, sure.
And I got the article published. I remember wife coming home and seeing this letter, and she opened it, and she said, "Hey, you're an author." At the time, by then I had started my doctoral program at Howard. And so I said, this is quite curious that this was something I had to do because I was involved in Caribbean and Latin American history. And this is what I do all the time. I just finished teaching courses in slavery in the Americas and slavery in the Caribbean. And I do a number of other things, but I've always been curious about Adventist history. And I often wondered why not very much was written about Caribbean history. And I see, and now there are many Caribbeans actually. The Caribbean is a huge place. And one section can be called Afro-Caribbean. There's actually Latin Caribbean and Francophone Caribbean. And the Caribbean I'm talking about is what is called the Eastern Caribbean, or the Lesser Antilles. It goes from the Virgin Islands all the way down to Trinidad. And because of ethno-historical commonalities, you have the Guyanas as well, and even along the coast of Central America can be called Afro, or what I also refer to as the English-speaking Caribbean. And so I got very much involved in trying to look to see, when the church started and what actually occurred in that area. And it's been fascinating ever since, but I think we need to have some kind of history written about it because what I think is written is very incomplete. For example, I wonder why what is written about the Caribbean is primarily written, it seems, by missionaries and for missionaries. And
Sure.
the Paul Harvey of Adventism in the Caribbean is not there. The other half, the other story. And so I said, well, maybe I need to pursue it. But then I realized that there are a number of obstacles to doing this. And so I am, while I deal with my secular history, this is something I'm very much interested in. And every now and then I will go to another conference and talk about slavery or abolition or whatever. But I feel I need to go back because originally I thought I was going to be actually a minister. And I ended up being a Bible teacher and so on. So now I think I have my calling, or a double calling.
Yeah.
I would add something to what Dr. Phillips said. His recently published work on the Hanson Place. It's the Hanson Place Church in New York City is an effort, I think a fine effort, along with R. Clifford Jones's work, James K. Humphrey and the Seventh-day Adventists, of framing Black Adventist history in the context of diaspora,
Right, exactly.
and which has been rarely done. In fact, Cyril Sepulveda, who was going to be on this panel, completed a history in 2005 called On the Margins of Empire. And I think it's a unique Adventist history because it's thesis-driven. And his thesis is that Adventism is a religion of the diasporas. The European diaspora, the Black diaspora. He actually sees
Good
Adventism, to the foreground of the diaspora. So.
Well, that's so important, I think, because when we talk about church growth today in the United States, and we sort of trumpet it, we're one of the few churches growing, but my sense of it is, it's the diaspora people that is, that's directing that growth here. Well, when you think about the writing of United States SDA Black history, and maybe not as true in the Caribbean, but it's very much always in the context of discrimination, race prejudice, ultimately slavery, going back. And the two of you here, Ben and Doug, can you reflect a little bit on the relationship between sort of the civil rights movement as it began in the 1950s in the U.S. and what we might say is the beginning of the modern Black SDA writing on this subject?
Well, one of the keys to Black history, to Black Adventist history, is that it's the growth, the phenomenal growth of Black Adventism occurred after World War II. Yeah, this is a basic fact of Black Adventist history. And of course, that was during the era of the inauguration of the regional conferences. We're talking 1945 through 47.
Are you saying something that's causative or simply coincidental?
Definitely causative. The milieu of racism that blacks underwent, and the grassroots movements and the protest. In fact, Dr. Calvin Rock is publishing a book this year called Progress and Protest. And his thesis is that the Black Adventist Church has survived and flourished because of protest. And we see that regional conferences arose from several grass movements that were largely lay-inspired, and it actually moved the hand of Adventist leadership. And this happened not only in the 1930s and 40s with James K. Humphrey and the tragic death of Lucy Byard, but it happened in the 60s with Miles Martin and Frank Hale. Actually, the General Conference, where they protested and rioted, and the church elected the first black vice president in F.L. Peterson.
In 62.
So the reaction to racism has actually led to black autonomy and leadership, and from there we see the growth that occurred post 1945 at the regional conferences.
Talk about an organizational change.
Sure.
And everything well, that's just a convenience and it works, but you're talking about an organizational change. That's a game changer, you would argue.
Well, with the 150th anniversary, when the General Conference was established on May 21, 1863, it was established for a mission. And this is why the regional conferences were established, for mission. And you don't hear that too often in the modern debate as to if we should demolish regional conferences. They were established for a mission, and they fulfilled their purpose.
Well, Doug, you wrote about a time, long before that, early 20th century. What are the sort of lessons you see?
Well, perhaps picking up on what Ben was saying, I think also, and in your question about civil rights, it places pressure on the church as a whole. And I think then creates a climate for someone like Ron Grable to come along and write Mission to Black America, E.G. White and Church Race Relations. And I can't speak for Ron Grable, of course, but for myself, in connection, parallel perhaps with Glen's reference to sort of correlating our Adventist history with history more broadly. Civil rights, the racial dilemma, is sort of one of the central issues of American history, certainly. And so I think for myself, that, although there were other factors, but that was an important one to sort of prompt someone like myself to go further into working on the subject. But I think my main point would have to do with how civil rights influences the church to change, and sort of almost requires something like what Grable did.
Now, the history of race relations in the Caribbean is going to be different
Yeah.
than that in the United States.
Well, very different. Actually, in the Caribbean, people are different races, but the emphasis is not on race. I remember coming here and going to AUC. All along I knew I was black, but then I had to think about people back home and how you saw them. And you saw them more in terms of class than race. And so you kind of have to think about it. In fact, I remember clearly walking on the campus of AUC with about 2 other students from Trinidad, and there is a trucker going through the campus, and he is saying nigger, 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 and that was the first time I actually heard it, and we actually joked about it because we didn't respond. We had a different orientation to the whole idea of race at the time. But for us, in terms of civil rights, civil rights is not as important in the Caribbean as much as independence, political independence. If you look at the development of the church in the Caribbean, the Caribbean I'm talking about, the Afro-Caribbean or the English-speaking Caribbean, the church started there very early. One of the earliest places the church started, back in the early 1880s. And it wasn't started by American missionaries. It wasn't started by American colporteurs. It was started by people writing to Bahal Creek because they had received tracts, signs of the time. And what concerns me, and one of the things I want to argue, is that we need to challenge what I call the dominant narrative of Adventism, Adventist history regarding the Caribbean. Because what you find is that Adventism is identified as starting in 1883. The famous story you always hear about John Byington telling them in New York, he was president, or at least he worked for the International Tract Society. These tracts that were given to this captain and told to almost haphazardly take them to the Caribbean, and he took them to all the way to Guyana, Georgetown, and he scattered them on the wharf. And according to the report is that people took them up and read about the Sabbath and began talking about the Sabbath and keeping the Sabbath. That story is repeated by missionaries in mission stories, then by George Enoch. I don't know if you know of him. He eventually became a missionary, I think, in India. But he wrote a book called The Advent Message in the Sunny Caribbean in 1907. And then it goes, and every author that wrote about the Caribbean repeats the same story and embellishes it. And it goes all the way up to...
Encyclopedia.
Yeah.
The ST Encyclopedia.
Yeah. You see, but what is amazing is that you never hear about Joseph Brathwaite, who in 1879 in Bowling Green, Ohio, attended a Cartwright, Dudley Cartwright's evangelistic meeting. Kenwright, yeah. And as a result of this, he returned to the Caribbean and took the message around and wrote a letter in early 1883 to Stephen N. Haskell, who was then the president of the New England Conference and the president of the New England International Tract Society, saying that here I am in a lunatic asylum, was in prison because this is what the authorities did to me, and could you help me? Now, I've been trying to find this guy, Brathwaite, and what I was able to find in the review of 1883, found that letter written to Haskell, says, in the West Indies. And it would seem to me that he did enough, because from the letter he mentions a number of other places, and there's another citation where we know of a number of countries that he visited and got that same kind of treatment. And so it would seem that that 1883 venture to South America was really not in abstract, that it was in response to something that had happened earlier. But the fact again is that the dominant narrative says this is when it began, and so what we find occurring, it seems, over and over, is that there's an absence of the convert and the voice of the convert. And what I'm suggesting is that if you're going to write the history of the Caribbean again, we need to look at other voices, female voices. We need to look seriously at the missionaries. When people talk about missionary sacrifice, they tend to want to look at what happened to missionaries in Africa. But there were missionaries in the Caribbean that were dying, Adventist missionaries. They went through a tremendous amount, and they're ignored completely. and their wives as well, because there were a number of tropical diseases in the Caribbean during that period that knocked a number of people out. They died. Many people died and so on. If you read the dialogue, some people were forced to come back and that kind of thing. Those people are not treated well, and so I think this is what we need to do.
Well, I think what you're talking yourself into here is to go away from this conference saying, this needs to be your front burner project. Not when you come back to it
That's a
occasionally.
huge project. It'll take years to do this.
Well, let's get started.
Well,
I'm doing it piece by piece, but it's a long project and it needs to be done by a number of individuals, hopefully. Yeah.
I was going to ask you if you've seen Floyd Greenleaf's new book.
No, not his new book.
On
I know the
it's
one in 93. The history, I know the one in 93.
It's a combination
Yeah,
and
right.
sort of a second edition
Yeah, right.
of the 2-volume set.
Yeah.
It includes the Caribbean.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, but what I think needs to occur is that we need to have a book written about Adventism in the entire Caribbean. And the Caribbean and Latin America, the Caribbean dwindles in significance when you talk about the size of Latin America. Brazil alone is the size of this country, and so on. And so, it is just too much to be able to cover and do what needs to be done to get some insights. We need to hear the voice of the people who were converted and what they did. Yeah.
Well, I want to break from my agenda of questions at this point. I've got some others, but let me just see what there might be from the floor. You might want to pose to the panel generally or to an individual.
I just want to say something
Yeah.
very quickly, if I can. One point that the popular rendering, you may call it quasi-history, I don't know, of the origins of Adventism in the Caribbean. One thing that it does speak to that I appreciate is the agency of, of course, the word agency is fraught in diaspora studies, because there's a current debate as to how much Africans, what part Africans played in the enslavements in the late 1400s, 1500s. If you say that they played no part, then they're victims. If you say that they played a significant part, then their agency is restored, and they're powerful, and they're brokers, as it were, in the. So, the narrative of the man, the missionary, the captain throwing the tracks, and the Black Caribbeans finding the tracks and then reading them and then writing to Battle Creek and requesting more literature and missionaries does speak to the agency that I see blacks exercising upon encountering Adventism. Adventists were persona non grata in the South before 1865. Not only because of their abolitionist beliefs, but as we see kind of comes to the fore when they're making an attempt to evangelize blacks in the South, a very northern mindset that did not jibe with the cultural mores of the South. And so when I say that the blacks wandered into the meetings when they were not being sought out, we know from Ellen White's, her hundreds of pages, did an 800-page compilation of what Ellen White says about black people, that there was indeed not only a neglect by Adventism at the time of going south and evangelizing blacks, but there was fraud and misappropriation of monies earmarked and raised for black missions. And so in this context, blacks are seeking Adventism out despite the fact that it'll be yet another strike against them. We see strong black women in particular. They're black, they're female, and now they're seeking out, they're Adventists.
Yeah.
This is 3 strikes against an individual of that day.
Yeah.
And so to accept Adventism, not only to accept it, but to exercise agency in accepting it, to where you're finding it. It's not so much coming to you. You're going out and you're finding it. This is a tremendous phenomenon at the time.
We have the same thing in the Caribbean. when the church got to the English-speaking Caribbean, the powerful church is the Church of England called the Anglican Church, and they felt very threatened. And their leaders characterized Adventism as not a church or a religion, but a cult. That was and a North American cult, which is also implying a negative. That means also that it is recent, and they're saying also that it is led by a female prophet.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And so what we find occurring is that a lot of the converts were actually expelled from their homes and their jobs. The same cave I talked about, he was a respectable young teacher, very promising teacher. And he got baptized on a Sunday, and on the Monday morning, he was expelled from teaching in the public school. Well, it was not the public school, the government schools, the Anglican schools. He was expelled, and the missionaries then had to see what they could do with him and so on. And we don't get that picture. You usually don't get that perspective at all. No, it's just about the converted individuals.
David?
An observation and a question. The observation is about the role of diaspora. And it's true that missiologists and church administrators in America have been recently making the point that Ben made, saying, well, the church in America is only growing because of migrants. And that is almost demonstrably true. But it also, there's something problematic about that, which is that it harks back to an imagined, to use Carl's terminology, the imagined golden age, when that wasn't true for the Adventist church. And I'm not sure if there was such a time. It may have been in the 50s, which of course is the real, we all know is the golden age, but certainly in the 19th century,
That's right.
the church is absolutely growing amongst migrants. They're a different set of migrants. They're migrants from Scandinavia in particular, and Germany.
And then from the south to the, from the
And
U.S.
internal
South
migrants
to the U.S.
yeah,
North.
Yes. But in 1910, the Adventist Church has 4 foreign language seminaries in America. Part of which is to train people to go as missionaries to Europe, but it's mostly to reach foreign language speakers in the United States.
The upper Midwest was almost entirely an immigrant church.
Exactly. So, and you still see it with the number of people with Scandinavian names in the Seventh-day Adventist churches.
The Beats family would not exist if it wasn't for the Russian German.
Well, Andersons, Rasmussens,
Yeah.
there's loads. So, we shouldn't imagine that we shouldn't imagine there's something wrong or something different now because we're growing from diaspora.
That's a very good catch.
But a question for Doug. You also wrote, your first monograph was on religion in the American Republic. What intersections do you see between your work on Sheaf and now on the First Church? There must be some points that you find from your two, you sort of, as it were, you have 2 different historiographies you're working with, and yet there must be points of significant intersection.
Well, to me, the rather exciting find, actually maybe the best way to summarize it is to use the words of Arno Bontam, who was a Seventh-day Adventist Harlem Renaissance writer, but he wrote, that's right, he wrote in 1950 upon the request.
Not simultaneously.
I
Seventh-day Adventist Harlem Renaissance writer.
simultaneously, I would say yes, sir.
We have some
He was
disagreement here.
principal,
This is getting exciting.
Teacher at Harlem Academy. Oh, I mean, we could extend this, but I just want to use his phrase because it's so helpful. In 1950, he said, Adventists started out solid. Now, this is one of the most respected interpreters, sensitive interpreters of African American history. Adventists started out solid on the race question, but then they compromised to appease the South, and they're still doing it to their own benefit. And so what I found, at least for a while, the first SDA church in Washington was bucking the trend of the onslaught of segregation around the turn of the century, with a gospel-based witness to oneness in Christ. And then here you have this man Sheaf, who was a absolutely passionate, fiery civil rights orator, and both before and after becoming an SDA. So that the conventional image that we sort of have that Seventh-day Adventist history is, or that there's this fundamental segregationist part of our DNA. I think is challenged by that. It doesn't in any way. It only underscores, and this is the big question everyone will ask then. Well, what happened? And that's indeed a challenge. But I think it only underscores, how dramatic and unfortunate, and what a missed opportunity there was.
To speak to your point, and you bring this out very, very clearly and compellingly in your work, Adventism in the American Republic, that Adventists, exegetes, and Bible scholars identified the United States as the lamb-like beast of Revelation 13 from their treatments of black people from chattel slavery. Okay, I mean, you can read Uriah Smith persuasively arguing that America has already spoken like a dragon because they have enslaved 2 to 4 million Africans, and he uses this as a proof of America's apocalyptic villainry. I think that one of the things that attracted blacks to Adventism, and my father did a really good a chart of, slavery did this. Let's say slavery broke up the family, slavery denied blacks literacy, and then Adventism's answer to all of this. We know that there's a phenomenon whenever someone becomes an Adventist, they usually go to school. Like right after they get baptized, they go to school. Right? So just ways in which Adventism spoke specifically to black people. I believe that blacks, we have accounts of blacks reading Adventist literature, and they are attracted to Adventism's criticism of the United States, Adventism's criticism of slavery. And I believe that that's one of the reasons why they joined Adventism in a form of social protest. I'm going out on a ledge here.
Well,
I mean, I've never heard that said before, but that's what I see from the extant documents.
I think in Sheaf's case, it was disillusionment with the Republican Party. And the fact that, because there was a generation there that was truly hopeful. Okay, we've got our 14th and 15th Amendments. We're on the way toward equality. And then that gets smashed in the 1890s. And so I can't. I got to stop, or else I'm going to launch into a long narrative. But I think it underscores your point.
Sure.
A question I had for you, and your response to David may be kind of where I was going, but was there anything that you didn't put in the Sheaf book, any major takeaway you had from the age of A.G. Daniels about...
Trying to gather some information for your book.
I've done plenty of mining in that, I'll tell you. But anything that is significant about Adventism that you could mention here?
Well, I mean, I think essentially put this in, although maybe not in these words, and that is, I think it connects back to this point that my brethren here are making about agency, and that is that Sheaf and the church that he built up here in Washington, I mean, they took Adventism and everything it had to offer, and they were determined to push it to its hilt, and they wanted it done fairly promptly. And most of Sheaf's dreams were not realized, and that ended up having an ill effect on his relationship with the denomination. But then you can show how the denomination had to change because they said, look, we don't want to lose all our black converts. We don't want to lose entirely the potential to win more. So we know that we're going to have to make changes. The one being that they just didn't trust Sheaf. They never put money into his project. But as soon as he was out for the second and last time, they put $18,000 to buy old Ephesus, now DuPont. That was a lot of money then, because we're all going to lose them all to sheaf.
And then the Negro Department, 1909,
Exactly the same
which
thing.
some say was a direct result of Sheaf's influence.
I would argue that.
The Sheaf and Washburn.
Because he suggested way back in 1901, look at all these departments for the immigrants.
Sure.
Let's have, and then, but it was really more closely related to what was happening in Washington in 1906 and 7. I think
Right.
that.
Right. Before you wrote your book on Lewis Sheaf, you told me, I think it was the cafeteria at WAU, maybe I'm getting it wrong here, but and you wanted to be the world's leading sheepologist. And I think that you are, I mean, without argument, you are the world's leading sheepologist.
Well, I can go
But you
part in peace now. but-
You told me that Lewis Sheaf is a well-educated Adventist. I'm saying of any race. We don't even need to use race as an adjective. Kellogg said he's the most ablest minister of our ranks.
Yep.
Of any color. This is what John Harvey Kellogg said. But Sheaf was casting about for ideologies and organizations that would empower black people. He was looking for them. Didn't he join? I mean, he was joining all these, and Adventism was that for him.
Yeah, everything that came along the pike. I think that he probably was not the most ideologically consistent person in the world. I mean, he was an absolute idealist for integration at some points, but when Marcus Garvey came along, he was a Garveyite. But I think I see that actually really, on the whole, more positively along the lines that you've just stated.
To shift gears here a bit, and thinking about black historiography, and a name came to me as we're just sitting here, not just out of the blue. And I know not much about him except that I had heard that he has been an Adventist who wrote a very well-received black history in the 1970s. Vincent Harding, do I have the name right?
Yeah.
And
I don't know if I heard whispers about him being an Adventist, but I'm not sure that I could verify that.
okay, so nothing really here of any knowledge about him. His work
I
that
know
came out was
his work.
highly
Yeah,
received.
but,
Sure.
yeah, but I don't think so.
Well, we on the occasion here of the 40th, I want us to link our topic with the archives. And to hear, I mean, I know Doug has worked here. Have you done work here in the archives as well?
Oh, yeah.
You foresee
Yeah.
doing work? What kinds of things have
it's
you
going
found?
to date me because when the archive, I started to go to the archives when it was down in Washington on Eastern Avenue. This is where I did the work for the book about the school in Trinidad, the university in Trinidad, and also on Cave. And I would come in and Bert Holoviak. And I guess I was one of the first people that would come there. And I actually had to get a letter of recommendation that I was an Adventist in good and regular standing in order to see the archive. And that bothered me
Oh, what's your
since.
name?
Something like that, some form of that.
You still would.
Yeah, but if you're going to have an archive, really, I don't want to be too pejorative here, but if you're going to have an archive, I think archives is for the public. What do we have to hide, really? And I think other people who are even not Adventists should be able to come and see. I've been doing some work on G.E. Peters, who was the head of the Negro department and so on. His father was a Moravian. And I wanted to know about what had actually transpired when he was a boy, because he actually was baptized in 1896. Yeah, 1896. And his father was a prominent Moravian minister. So you know what I did? I went to the Moravian archives, and I saw the correspondence, the tension that was happening in meetings in Antigua. This is in the Caribbean, and so on. And they never asked me what religion I was or anything like that. And I saw, because his father eventually became an Adventist, but for 5 years he worshiped both on Sundays and Sabbaths. And he read himself into the churches. And eventually he became an Adventist. And I don't know if you know about George Peters, anyone? He was in charge of the Negro Department, what was called a Negro Department I think about 1919 he served, or 1929 he served for a short while, but from 1941 to 1956 he was the head of the Negro Department. And he's originally from Antigua, the Caribbean. So on. And he was able to go up there. And I'm saying, I go to archives all the time, and nobody asks me to.
Well, maybe this
Show
is
my
the
proof.
moment to have a statement. If a person wanted to come in and study A.G. Daniels just because they thought this was an important religious leader and they were collecting important religious administrative leaders, but this person has no affiliation, what would be the position here of the archive as far as looking at Daniels?
It's very straightforward. If you hold a job at a university, we will allow you entrance. And so a few weeks ago,
That's good.
so
Excellent.
in your case, we wouldn't actually ask for a letter. If there was an ordinary Adventist who wanted to research something, we would want a letter of, some sort of letter of reference from a church officer affirming that. But if you're at a university, hold an academic job, you have to fill in a form and you have to sign an undertaking. That's new, it didn't exist before. But you have to affirm now that you won't steal things and stuff like that.
But when I came here with a student, a doctoral student,
In that case,
luckily, the secretary of the General Conference was actually my teacher in Trinidad, J.R. Thompson. So he wrote me a letter immediately, and I brought it down and he said,
a letter from the executive secretary of the GC will serve. But if you're a PhD student, then a letter from your supervisor or major professor. So it's only somebody who has no academic affiliation who would require a letter of reference about being a church member.
Fair enough.
And we have had a number of just in the last year we've had a number of academics who
At least three that were,
we don't know what faith they were
yeah,
actually.
they were, we know that they were not Adventist.
Yes.
That
That's
they
very
were
encouraging. That
academics.
is extremely
Uh,
encouraging.
Our policy of allowing researchers access to this facility, it sort of vets you to make sure you're serious, and also to see if you're trustworthy, because obviously you're dealing with documents, and of course there are archives horror stories of documents missing or maimed or what have you. And so there's the trust and there's the vetting to make sure that you're a serious researcher.
This is true. I maybe I should take that back, because I remember going to Oxford and going to Rhodes.
Yes.
And you have to have verification in order to go in there. And they wanted to know, well, are you serious? Where are you along? So that you're not wasting our time.
Exactly.
That kind of thing. So I see that. Thank you very much.
Doug, tell us about your experience here, archivally speaking, with
Well,
Chief.
I think that it illustrates a lot of what was said earlier. I mean, the richness of the resources. I'll just give one example that was a surprise to me, but simply the letters to the secretary and sometimes the treasurer, I think, of the General Conference, 1890s, turn of the century, and they had to write in every month. They didn't get their check automatically. They had to write in and say, please give me $10 from my account. And you were really only allowed to take 80% unless you could justify. But anyway, those details, those letters, some of them just purely pro forma, but others of them just giving the most fascinating, helpful little details. And so with that is the challenge of organizing and categorizing it all. And I think with regard to Black SDA history, there's at least one example of the kind of the horror story that Dr. Yost referred to, where somebody thought, well, let me pull all this stuff out, and then it just kind of, it's in a box on it. But my third point would be to underscore the incredible helpfulness and knowledge of the personnel. So Bert Holoviak and now his successors that, well, I think I've seen something like that somewhere, and pulls it out. So.
We are running out of time, but one last important question, but it has to be quick. What do you see as a future agenda for Black SDA history? Who wants to just kind of go?
There's a phenomenon, and everyone in this room is familiar with it, that a phenomenon in Adventist historiography that oftentimes it's not about the caliber of the histories, it's that just something needs to be written. Many times in Adventism, history is an authority because it's the only thing on it, right? It's the only thing written on it. And so what we're trying to do now is inspire people to write, just write Black history.
Doesn't have to
But-
be definitive necessarily, just.
Well, fortunately, we have some very sophisticated scholars now engaging in Black SDA history, but it's not enough. And oftentimes, Dr. Trim, we just what's the book by Eva? The book on Madagascar, or Adventism in Mauritius,
Yeah, it's Madagascar. It's a sociological study.
yeah. So there are things are being written, but oftentimes they're kind of quaint or nuanced, and it wouldn't be a very impactful kind of part of Black Adventist history. But that's that's you research what attracts you, and we're all attracted to things for different reasons. But I mean, I would like to see some major. My first book was Crucial Moments, and Crucial Moments is the 12 most important events in Black Adventist history. I know that's a very ambitious title, and I was young and naive when I wrote it, so forgive me. But choosing to write on things that have really moved the church. I think one of you alluded to the fact that Adventism has been shaped. Broader Adventism has been shaped by Black Adventism. My father theorized in his dissertation that the work in the South was a prelude and an impetus for international missions. And the Black work in the South was a forecast or a foretaste, a very catalytic foretaste of the eventual browning and blackening of Adventism, if you will. Adventism is now what, third African, third of Adventists are in continental Africa. And so the story of Black Adventism is a story of Adventism. And so I would like to see more things written, and more things written on the underlying impact of Black Adventist history.
For the Caribbean, what I think is needed now going forward, the leaders and educators in the Caribbean, Adventists I'm talking about, because we have two universities there. One is called the University of Southern Caribbean in Trinidad and North Caribbean University in Jamaica. I'd like to see them possibly begin to develop and archive themselves. There is no archive. But I constantly badger them about what they do with the things they have and so on. And the things are kept helter-skelter. And then the things from the conferences. I mean, the early documents, it is easier to get them, I think, at churches. The original records of the churches and so on. And I think if we could begin to think of trying to preserve and collect, because a lot of stuff on early Adventism that is out there, actually, but it needs to be recognized and brought in and have some appreciation. Amen. But I understand what the ministers are, Jesus is coming soon, and we don't, and their view of history is that it is of the past, where my view is history is the present and the future. But theirs is about the past, they don't want to waste time with it. And the other thing is the money that would be involved in doing this, because sometimes they don't understand fully what a historian or a good author, the time and energy and what needs to be done, and that you need to have a quality final product.
Yes.
And all these things take money. And so they want to put it in a tent, and they can bring more souls in and that kind of thing. But there are a lot of questions, I think, that history can answer about the present by looking at the future in the Caribbean and everywhere. And I think we really need to begin to look at revisionist Adventist history, and even talk about the subaltern approach, where you have this new voice talking about what the church really means in these various areas in the struggle and the hope we have for the future. For Christ's coming.
You mean revisionists of the histories that have been written?
Yes,
Right.
yes, of what was written. No, not.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean.
Oh, sure, sure.
Anything to add to that?
I'll just use the example of there is a 3-volume work that is in progress. It's called The History of the World Christian Movement. But it's my field of history of Christianity is being completely rewritten from this more global and diverse perspective. And it's an enormous, you talk about an investment, and I've been waiting for volume 2 for 10 years, and finally it came out, but it only goes up to 1800. I thought it was going to take, but I think that we really do need somehow to be able to put the story together in a way that does justice to the realities of past, present, and no doubt future.
I want to say one last thing, and this is piggybacking on what both of my distinguished panelists said. Black history, in the future, Black Adventist history may not be Black Adventist history.
True.
It's going to take, this is one of the things I've learned from working here, is when I first came on, Dr. Trim said, you're no longer going to be just a historian of Black Adventist history. Now that you're working here, you're going to be a historian of Adventism. And I realized that when we try to narrow the field and be, let's say, myopic historians, that we are missing out on so much that there's going to be all sorts of inaccuracies, gross inaccuracies. And so with this whole notion of the regional conferences, obviously a history needs to be written of the formation of the regional conferences. It's not going to be a Black Adventist history, because there are so many dynamics and moving pieces and contributors that made the regional conference formation possible. That, you know, it's we can call it Black Adventist history, but it's going to be broad, and it's going to include the whole Adventist church. And I see that as that's the future of Black Adventist history. It's going to be more inclusive and more acknowledging of the different factors that contribute to what we call Black Adventist history.
Well, on that prophetic note, which we have on tape, and we'll revisit in 20 years and see how accurate, we have to come to a close. Thank you so much, panel. I learned a lot.